I was particularly influenced by James Hansen because I knew he was kind of a climate hero. I heard that he had become a very strong vocal proponent for nuclear, and that caught my attention because I thought, if we're listening to him about how serious climate change is, then should we also be listening to him about the solution? So the bad boys are Ted Nordhaus and Michael Schellenberger. In 2004, they published this essay called The Death of Environmentalism that made a big splash at the time. It didn't mention nuclear at all. In fact, they hadn't really started to think about nuclear at that point, as far as I understand. But it did present a different way of thinking about environmental problems.
Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm Mark Lynas, and I've had a few bad ideas in my time. I used to go out in the nighttime to destroy GMO crops, and I also opposed nuclear power. But then when I looked at the science, I found I got it wrong. Oops! I've learned the hard way that none of us are right all the time. So now I'm here to challenge the assumptions that we all too often take for granted, because the future depends on us getting it right. Our guest today is someone who writes with the kind of clarity that makes you wonder if you've ever really understood an issue before she explained it. Rebecca Tuhus-Dubrow is a journalist and essayist whose works appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Nation, The New Yorker, amongst many others. And she's got a real gift for diving into the cultural undercurrents of our time, from things like the anxieties of parenthood to the surprising rise, in this case, of pro-nuclear environmentalism. And she comes up with these incredible stories which are as thoughtful as they are unsettling. And in her new book, Atomic Dreams, the new nuclear evangelists and the fight for the future of energy, there we are, she looks into the new generation of climate-conscious pro-nuclear campaigners. Rebecca, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we tend to do this in the format of bad ideas. So it's called, Saving the World from Bad Ideas. And we thought that the bad idea you could be saving the world from with this new book is that everyone hates nuclear. Because I think there is sort of a general sense out there that nuclear is unpopular. It's historically been thought of as dirty. The environmental movement's always been against it. There's people who certainly of the boomer generation who cut their teeth in anti-nuclear activism, protesting, shutting down plants, stopping them being built, and so on. And that's the story that you tell in this book, actually, because you start quite early on with a nuclear power plant called Diablo Canyon in the Californian coast, which I think was built in the early 70s, was it?
Construction began in 1968, and in part because of all the protests, it didn't actually get completed until the mid-80s.
Right. So, I mean, this is a fascinating story. It's one I've tried to tell myself sometimes, and I'm a very small character in your book as a pro-nuclear activist over some previous years. But tell us the story of the book. I mean, I saw it started life perhaps as a New Yorker article. So, what gave you the idea, and what made you think this was a book that needed to be written?
I have been obsessed with climate change for quite a long time. Starting in high school, I learned about it and was very disturbed. And I kind of assumed that renewables were the answer. I was a pretty hardcore environmentalist, and I didn't have particularly strong views on nuclear. I think it just didn't come up so much when I was growing up in the 90s, but I had vaguely negative associations. And then in the 2010s, I started to hear more about the argument that nuclear needed to be part of the solution. I was particularly influenced by James Hansen because I knew he was kind of a climate hero.
He was the NASA scientist whose testimony to the Senate in, 1988?
Yeah.
Was the first, really, wasn't it?
During a heat wave in the summer of 1988, he testified before Congress and said that the greenhouse effect, as it was called then, had been detected and it was changing our climate now. And it received front page coverage throughout the country, maybe the world. He's credited with bringing the issue to public attention, widespread public attention for the first time. So I knew about him kind of through my parents, who are also hardcore environmentalists. And I heard that he had become a very strong vocal proponent for nuclear. And that caught my attention because I thought, if we're listening to him about how serious climate change is, then should we also be listening to him about the solution?
Tell us a bit more about the main characters in the book. So, where does it start, and whose stories do you pick up, and why did you choose them?
Yeah. So I started looking into it toward the beginning of 2019, and I came across a couple of small groups just in my online research. One was called Generation Atomic, and it was founded by this young man, Eric Meyer, and he was kind of trying to make nuclear fun and spread pro-nuclear memes on Twitter. And the other group was Mothers for Nuclear. And the name, of course, just caught my attention because it sounded so counterintuitive. And once I started talking to them, I learned, they worked at Diablo Canyon, actually, the women who had founded this group, Mothers for Nuclear. And they were also kind of classic environmentalists, hippies. So just the kind of contradiction, or the perceived contradiction, that people like that would be very strongly pro-nuclear, that interested me. So my New Yorker article focused largely on them, but also put them in the context of this larger but still quite small pro-nuclear movement that was emerging at the time.
Then there's the bad boys. I think you give a whole chapter to them. Tell us who they are and when they come into the story.
You know all of these people too. So, and as you said, you are a minor character in the book. But so the bad boys are Ted Nordhaus and Michael Schellenberger. And I start their story in 2004, or leading up to 2004. In 2004, they published this essay called The Death of Environmentalism that made a big splash at the time. And it didn't mention nuclear at all. In fact, they hadn't really started to think about nuclear at that point, as far as I understand. But it did present a different way of thinking about environmental problems, rather than the sort of traditional Sierra Club approach of, reducing energy use, reducing even population, just trying to minimize human impact in every way. And I think it's fair to say the Sierra Club and that generation of environmentalists saw human impact as essentially bad. So what Nordhaus and Schellenberger were trying to advance, and it wasn't entirely their idea. It grew out of this project called the New Apollo Project, or the Apollo Alliance, that proposed that a new way of tackling climate change would be, rather than a carbon tax, would be to build out, clean energy infrastructure, and as a way of reviving the manufacturing base and the economy, and creating millions of good jobs, a huge build out of renewable energy. So it was kind of a philosophical departure. It was, more of a can-do spirit, and rather than sort of telling people what they can't have, or what we have to sacrifice, it was putting a new spin on building and creating.
I think everyone has a kind of conversion story in this narrative, don't they? I mean, I know I've got one. Jim Hansen, I think, doesn't he date his conversion to reading Tom Bleece's book, Prescription for the Planet? I mean, you spoke to Tom Bleece, right? What did you think of him?
He was an interesting character, like many of the characters in this book. And he basically was trying to write a novel about a fictional, obviously, president, this guy who sort of ends up becoming president. And he wanted to write something about his energy policy. And he heard something on the radio about a nuclear reactor that could consume waste. And he started looking into it. And it turned out that it was this project that was developed at Idaho National Lab and Argonne, and the integral fast reactor, which has become this sort of mythical project among pro-nuclear people to some extent. But anyway, he basically became convinced that the project was killed by the Clinton administration and Democrats in 1994. And Tom Bleece basically became convinced that it could have been this panacea.
I mean, this is a story that's important to me too, because I think reading Tom Bleece's book was my initial conversion story well. And, he and I spoke a lot about the integral fast reactor, and I think it was GE Hitachi had a modernized version that they were trying to sell. But, what really blew my mind was that if you look at how fast reactors work, there's no inherent limit to the amount of energy you can produce, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I reran the figures for the UK yesterday, just for something else. And so if you look at all of the spent fuel that we've got stacked up, I think it's about 20,000 tons or something. But if you think of the energy that's there, if you run it in a fast reactor cycle, we could run the whole of the UK at current electricity consumption rates for about 2,500 years. So the idea that there's like this fundamental limitation on energy, and we all have to sort of reduce what we consume, and it's a completely different paradigm to what environmentalism started with, and it just kind of blew my mind. And I think the same happened to pretty much whether or not the reactors are a sort of economically realistic prospect isn't it really? It's just about the fundamental physics. I just didn't know that.
Mm-hmm. And Tom is this, I think, very curious person, and he had dropped out of college in 1971 and just started traveling and all over the world and hitchhiking and riding freight trains and sky hitching, which is something he told me about that I had not previously heard about. I'm not sure if anyone else has ever managed to do it, but
what is it?
He would show up at airports where private planes were taking off and just sort of ask if he could tag along, and they would often say yes. And so he would just, hitch a ride on a private plane. And eventually he ended up working in Alaska for several months a year fishing, and then making enough money that he could spend the rest of the year just traveling with his family. So, kind of unconventional guy, and became, I think, just really obsessed with when he learned about this reactor and what it could do, which, as you're suggesting, sounded almost sort of magical. He wrote a book after setting aside the novel. He wrote this book, Prescription for the Planet, that I think almost no one has heard of. It was self-published, but it was actually incredibly influential sort of behind the scenes because it did end up having a big impact on James Hansen. Tom emailed Hansen just before it was about to come out, and he said, "You're always talking about climate change and how terrible it is, but you never say what we should do about it." And kind of amazingly, Hansen replied, and he was like, "Okay, send me your book." And he did, and thought he'd never hear from him again. But a few weeks later, according to Tom, James Hansen calls him on the phone, and he's really excited that he's read his book and learned about this reactor. So I did manage to have an email correspondence with Hansen, and he remembered it a little bit differently. I'm not sure he would say that he would give Tom Blees all the credit, but he said his interest in nuclear had grown gradually over time, and he had been increasingly pessimistic that renewables, at least at that time, could meet the demand. And he was talking to people from utilities. So when he read this book, it was kind of like, wow, this could really be the answer when he learned about this new kind of reactor. So he plugged the book repeatedly on Charlie Rose and in his own book and to his email list. So yeah, I think the fact just that it had such a big influence on Hansen, who in turn had a huge influence on a lot of other people, including me, shows, the impact that Tom Blees has had.
Yeah, I mean, I remember. I think my conversion was like in 2007, 2006. I can't remember the exact time, but I was writing columns for the New Statesman in the UK, and I'd just been at an energy conference, and there was a lady from the nuclear industry actually, and she mentioned at the time that 20% of the UK's power was produced without carbon emissions from nuclear. And actually, I had no idea. I mean, it's so embarrassing that I just didn't know this. But I was just like, oh, well, why would you want to shut that down if climate change is your top priority. Maybe why not even build more of it? So I kind of hazarded a few thoughts in my next column about this and got huge pushback.
Yeah.
People are emailing me from, all activist friends of mine who, I'd been up trees with, like stopping road projects and stuff like that. And so I realized straight away how, as if I should have known how kind of tribal this was and how deep-seated people's opinions are on this. And so like energy tribalism is a kind of recurring theme, isn't it, when you talk to people and, in your book as well?
I think for people who, and I think it is certainly generational to some extent, and for people who grew up thinking that, with these very strong associations with weapons and with atmospheric weapons testing and the fear of accidents, I think it is really hard to see it any other way other than just very dangerous and dirty. And yeah, I think there's kind of a new tribalism that's not entirely new. There was a lot of strong pro-nuclear sentiment in the post-war era too, but this more recent iteration of the pro-nuclear movement can also be tribal, and you sort of come across the same beliefs, the same lingo, the same studies that are referenced when you talk to people in that world. Although it is also, there are sort of different factions within the pro-nuclear movement too, which you may know about.
Well, describe these factions.
There are a couple of different lines. Like, there are the people who are really into advanced reactors and even like thorium. They think thorium is going to be the answer. And then there are others who actually think that, and this is like Michael Schellenberger and also, Mothers for Nuclear, who really want to defend the existing fleet. And they think that if we get too excited about these advanced reactors that don't exist yet, it's kind of tarnishing the reputation of the existing fleet, which they think is great. So that's one kind of dividing line. Also, I think there are some who are really strongly pro-nuclear, like, and really kind of anti-renewable, whereas there are other groups like this group, Good Energy Collective, that I see as more, they're explicitly trying to kind of build alliances with others on the left and with the environmental movement. And so they see, I don't think they see nuclear as a panacea. They see it as one of a number of viable options that can all work together. And their tone is somewhat different. And there's also the attitude towards climate change. And I thought of you because I know you were an author of the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, but I know you also are more, like me, I think, more alarmed about climate change than some of the other eco-modernists who frame it a little bit differently. So I think that's another divide. Like, there are different grounds for the different views, but like part of it is just a different way of looking at it. And of course, you can correct me about my characterization of your views, but I know like I think your most recent book, I know you've written more than one book about, what we can expect if temperatures continue to rise and how terrifying it is. Whereas some of the other eco-modernists really push back against what they see as climate alarmism or catastrophism, like Ted Nordhaus has written and others at the Breakthrough Institute have written a fair amount about that lately.
Yeah, I talked with Ted about this, and we don't see eye to eye. I think he's a bit more lukewarmist, I think that's the term, than I am. I do accept that, and this is different from most conventional environmental framing, that fossil fuels aren't just bad and evil.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, people compare them with slavery, and they say we're addicted to them and we just have to get off fossil fuels straight away. And of course, fossil fuels are the, energetic basis of the entirety of modern civilization. They still comprise of like 80% of primary energy, and that's barely shifted about 5 or 10% in like the last several decades. So you can't just get off fossil fuels unless you want to kill billions of people and we want to, totally transform our societies in a very, very negative way. So I accept all of that. But at the same time, I do think that the impacts of climate change, as we're currently seeing, are increasingly catastrophic and very worrying indeed, particularly in the planet's ecology. I spend a lot of time looking at coral reefs. I was at a conference in the Maldives, a hardship posting, of course, in January, and the corals there have just emerged from their fifth major bleaching event across all of the Indian Ocean. In fact, all of the global ocean. So this is a biome which is being pushed, towards extinction, and that's 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming, and we're going to be a lot higher than that, even at the most optimistic projections for the clean energy transition. So for me, that's why I'm pro-nuclear. It doesn't make that much sense to be pro-nuclear and not too worried about climate change, other than just to troll the Greens or because you like reactors or something like that. So the kind of climate hawk pro-nuclear thing is sort of fundamental to me, and that was why I changed my mind to start with.
Yeah, me too. I mean, that's why I got interested in it. And I was a little confused at first when I realized that some of the same people who were promoting nuclear were sort of climate, I don't know if they were climate skeptics, but advancing, I guess, what they would see as a more moderate view. But I think there is, as I say in the book, I came to understand it a little better eventually. Like, there is some coherence to the position. They think that climate alarmism is kind of analogous or similar to nuclear, like to overstated fears of nuclear, and that it all goes back to sort of this misguided notion that nature is something sacred, not to be tampered with. And so I kind of came to understand it better, but I still am very alarmed about climate change, and I think we can see, the damage that's already occurring, and I wouldn't, downplay that.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to see nature as sacred as well, actually. I don't think we should mine in Antarctica. I think we should protect the high seas from exploitation. I don't think that all of the natural world should be exploited for human benefits. I'm pro-rewilding, and I want to see a return of the wilderness and the, a naturally flourishing planet with more effective ecosystems and biodiversity and all of that. For me, that's fundamental, actually.
Yeah.
So it's but I don't see nuclear fission as somehow the opposite of that either.
Mm-hmm.
There's been, as I think you mentioned in the book, there's been a natural nuclear reactor, wasn't there, a couple of billion years ago in West Africa, just because there was a lot of uranium-235 in the rocks. So this idea that it's somehow completely unnatural, tampering with nature, playing God, all those kinds of things, which are also behind the fears of GMOs, actually, I think maybe that's ebbed away. And you talk about this in your book a bit in terms of how opinions changed on this issue. Is that what you saw as well?
Yeah, I think definitely climate has been part of it. My book is pretty US focused, so I can mainly speak about that. But historically, Republicans, conservatives didn't really have a problem with nuclear. They weren't necessarily, passionately pro-nuclear, but they didn't have a problem with it. It was the counterculture, the new left, that turned very strongly against nuclear. So in recent years, though, it's been the left, or, Democrats, liberals, that have become increasingly open to nuclear because of climate concerns and because of learning that it's, low carbon and could play a role. So I think there's that. I think there's also just that it's not new anymore. I think it was really shocking to people, especially because of, the way most people first learned about atomic science was after the bombs fell in Japan, and just learning about, this phenomenon that did sound very unnatural or very new anyway. And, of actually splitting atoms apart, I think it was disturbing to people. And I think what always happens, though, is that now it's, there's so much else that's newer, and, the new technologies may be disturbing in the same way, but nuclear power is not. It's lost to that strangeness. And I think that's actually a big part of it.
Yeah. So did you find yourself changing your mind when you were talking to these people? I mean, some of them are pretty persuasive. I know this from personal experience, and they believe in their cause as passionately as anyone believes in any cause.
You mean?
So did they change your mind?
You mean pro-nuclear people?
Yeah, pro-nuclear people. I know you talk a bit about anti-nuclear people as well, but the pro-nuclear are sort of the centerpiece. So yeah, did they change your mind?
Well, I think by the time I started researching it, I was pretty open to it. And, Yeah, I mean, at times, I would say my views evolved and kind of fluctuated. And at times, I was talking to a bunch of pro-nuclear people, reading a lot of pro-nuclear literature, and I was pretty on board. Then I also, talked to anti-nuclear people, and I guess in the end, my views were sort of somewhere in between. Or
Well, let me cut in there and just ask you, what anti-nuclear arguments did you find most persuasive that we should take most seriously? Because as a pro-nuclear, I'm always dismissing them and saying how stupid and wrong they are. But tell me what the anti-nuclear people have said, which you think, okay, that's actually a really serious point.
I mean, I think one obvious one is that it's really expensive to build.
That's undeniable. Yeah.
Then there are the arguments that, like, if you take the whole picture into account, it's actually cheaper to have clean, firm power to balance renewables. But what's most persuasive to me is not economics, because I just don't tend to know as much about that or think as much about that, but just the scary aspect of it. And I think I talked to a bunch of, I know what pro-nuclear people say about radiation, and that, like, linear no thresholds is totally off base.
You probably need to explain what that is.
The idea that any amount of radiation can be harmful or is harmful. There's no threshold below which exposure is benign. And that's sort of a major tenet of radiation science going back to post-war era, or maybe earlier. But then I would talk to actual radiation scientists. Oh, there's also a theory called hormesis, that low levels of radiation can actually be beneficial.
It's there in some hot springs, isn't it? They're a bit radioactive, and people feel they get a health benefit from it, right?
Yeah, that is probably true. When I talked to, and that's been advanced by this guy Edward Calabrese at UMass Amherst, but his background is not in radiation science, and I was totally open to all of these theories, but then when I talked to radiation experts, it seemed to me that it was actually still very contentious, and there's still a fair amount that we don't know for sure, especially about low level exposures. So I guess, I think I was convinced that nuclear should be on the table, that it should be part of the solution. But I still think these other energy sources have a lot of advantages as well, or nuclear does have problems, does have, significant challenges that can sometimes be downplayed in pro-nuclear circles.
Yeah. Obviously I've spent a lot of time at blown up nuclear power stations, having been to Chernobyl doing a film with Channel 4 back a long time ago, and then afterwards going with Robert Stone filming Pandora's Promise to Fukushima.
Yeah.
And I think Robert Stone's a fairly significant character, and you do talk about Pandora's Promise and some of the characters in that, including, obviously Michael Schellenberger and Stuart Brand too. Tell us how, what was going on there. Was it a big deal, or was it just Turkey?
No, that's one thing I learned in my reporting, that it was a bigger deal than I had realized. When I was reporting the New Yorker article, I learned about Pandora's Promise. I hadn't seen it when it came out in, I think, 2013. So I learned about it, and the characters, Heather Hoff and Kristen Zaitz, the Mothers for Nuclear, they had seen it when it came out, and it was influential for them because it kind of validated what they had already started to think when they were working at Diablo Canyon, and starting to think that maybe their jobs aligned with their environmentalist values. So I think seeing Pandora's Promise was a big deal for them. And you told me that it was sort of significant in that you spent time with these other advocates promoting the movie. And so I think, that kind of community started to coalesce.
Yeah, we all went to the Sundance Film Festival,
Yeah.
Got drunk loads, had an absolute blast, yeah.
Yeah. But what Ted Nordhaus told me that was really interesting was that it was also really pivotal in other ways, especially in terms of funding, because with Pandora's Promise, Robert Stone, he's the director, he had to raise money for the movie. So through the process of doing that, he got some mainly like Silicon Valley donors, the Pritzker family, Rachel and Roland Pritzker. They're sort of left-leaning philanthropists. They also put some money up for the film. And then as part of that sort of deal, I don't know if deal is the right word, but, along with putting up money for the film, some of these funders also donated to the Breakthrough Institute, specifically for a report on, I think it was called How to Make Nuclear Cheap. So just by having this film that was kind of like a rallying point, a way to get people's attention, but also get people to start donating money behind the scenes. So it was important in that way.
Yeah, another thing about Pandora's Promise that may have been pivotal is, and I need to choose my words carefully here, but the way that it persuaded Michael that he was going to be a very important person in some way or other. I don't want him to sue me, but so I'm not going to say he turned more narcissistic or something, but certainly he enjoyed the limelight. Is this something you saw as well?
Well, yeah, that's what I heard from Ted and from Alex Trembath, who is now deputy director of the Breakthrough Institute. And he told me that because there was a split at the Breakthrough Institute, I should probably go back and explain that Ted Nordhaus and Michael Schellenberger, after they wrote this kind of explosive essay that got lots of attention, The Death of Environmentalism, they founded a think tank called the Breakthrough Institute that has been really central in this whole pro-nuclear movement. And they had a falling out, I guess, in 2015, I think it was. And I was asking Alex Trembath, and he came to the Breakthrough Institute as a very young man, right after college at Berkeley. And he was also someone who had been more of a traditional environmentalist and was kind of gradually convinced by the different approach of the Breakthrough Institute. And he had a lot of very kind things to say about Michael, actually, that he saw him as a really great mentor who was, generous with his time and great to work with and, brilliant. But I mean, I'm paraphrasing all of this, but he did say that he dated the tension between Michael and Ted back to Pandora's Promise, because he thought Michael, with the attention of being sort of a movie star, and that he started to focus more on his personal brand at that time. And that made things difficult, working together at the Breakthrough Institute.
Yeah, I mean, Michael's almost like our kind of fallen angel. I've never met anyone who was as charismatic or as effective an organizer as he was for our issues. And yet he's gone in a very strange direction. He's now more or less a kind of full MAGA supporter, as far as I can tell from the odd bits that pop up on social media. And you have this strange kind of final chat with him in the book where you're both recording each other surreptitiously, I think. So there's obviously not much trust there by that stage. Like, what was happening then?
I mean, I just went to interview him, and at a certain point in the interview, I asked if I could record, as I always do, and he asked if we could chat on background first. I said, sure. Then after a few minutes of talking on background, I did start recording. About halfway through the interview, he got a notification on his phone, and before it went black again, I saw this sort of familiar blue color. And I had been using this recording app a lot because I'd been doing a lot of interviews, and it was the same blue as my recording app. So I just asked, "Oh, are you recording this too?" He was, and he had, I think, I can only assume, been recording the whole time, even when we were, before I had started recording. And to be fair, I understand wanting to record your conversations with a journalist. There are good reasons to want to do that. As he said later, that he should have told me. So it was a bit jarring. It's actually one of my sort of fears in life, is to be surreptitiously recorded.
So, I mean, just to finish up on this, what do you think of where he's ended up now?
I haven't been following it that closely, but yeah, as far as I understand, he's become a Trump supporter. And I think it's interesting, and he's sort of I also am trying to choose my words carefully. You can tell. But I mean, I say in the book, I mean, I think he's touted what can be characterized as conspiracy theories. I also think, he purported to become a free speech advocate. And as I said, I haven't been following that closely. Like he was really fighting against disinformation. He was fighting against the people who were fighting disinformation because he thought it was
not quite the same thing. Well, moving on to one or two of the other characters, there's Stuart Brand, who was pretty significant for me. His book Whole Earth Discipline, which I think was 2011, was a real
2009.
Oh gosh, was it? Oh gosh, right. Thanks for the correction. No, but that was a real bombshell. I mean, he's been a really critical person, hasn't he?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and just to sort of as a segue between maybe Schellenberger and Stuart Brand, I don't know. I think there is something. I mean, I asked you once, what do you think it is that characterizes pro-nuclear advocates, or people who are willing, especially early pro-nuclear advocates, who are willing to take this very unpopular stance? And you said, you don't like consensus. And I think there's this sort of continuum. You have to be willing to question conventional wisdom, and that's really important. But then there can also be, like, you can take that too far. It can become, because it's conventional wisdom, you have to defy it. Sometimes conventional wisdom is actually correct. So there's that.
Particularly if it's scientific conventional wisdom.
Yeah,
I think that's the difference really, is rather than sort of political movements which may have things entirely wrong. I mean, this pertains to the theme of the podcast of saving the world from bad ideas. The bad ideas, if they're not science based, they can still be universally held. But so for me, that's the kind of lodestar: is what's the majority scientific opinion on something, on nuclear or on GMOs or indeed on climate change, which is why I'm in the kind of climate alarmist camp, because I think that's really where the majority of science is too.
So I think that's true for a lot of the pro-nuclear advocates. It was both recognizing what they saw as an underappreciated scientific consensus, also being willing to go against the more cultural conventional wisdom. But yeah, so Stuart Brand, for those who don't know, he was a 60s icon. He founded this publication called the Whole Earth Catalog that was catering to all of these communes, to these youngsters who were going back to the land in the 60s. And he also was an early figure in kind of the internet, and promoting the internet and seeing it as this kind of liberating phenomenon. So in 2009, he wrote this book, Whole Earth Discipline, that kind of reconsidered some of his earlier work, like the Whole Earth Catalog, and all of the Back to the Land stuff was kind of about like personal liberation and maybe having a solar panel on your commune so you could generate your own energy and be independent and, be independent from consumer society. But motivated largely by climate, he started to reconsider nuclear, and sort of this bigger philosophical reconsideration, I think. Like, maybe what's natural isn't necessarily good. So, back in the 60s, living on the land and small distributed energy was seen as more harmonious with nature. And he was starting to think that maybe he was also reconsidering GMOs, which he had, I think, previously opposed. And he was thinking that, these approaches that seem to sort of violate nature could actually be the tools we need to save the planet.
Yeah, and then there's newer people who come in. Tell us the story of Isabel, otherwise known as Isotope.
She grew up in Brazil I think she's probably in her 30s now. So her name's Isabel Bomecki, and she was growing up in Brazil, and she was leaving her high school one day and was stopped by someone asking her if she was a model because she was very beautiful. And she said no, but it turned out there was a contest happening the next day that she entered, and she won this modeling contest and ended up leaving Brazil and coming to the US. So she was also interested in science, and she followed some scientists on Twitter and started hearing a bit about nuclear there. And again, because of climate concerns, started to think maybe this could be important. So she ended up becoming what she called a nuclear influencer. And she would make these kind of snappy videos where she would start off with like a makeup tutorial and then pivot to a lesson about the virtues of nuclear. She's also, and she was, so I think when she kind of arrived on the scene and arrived on Twitter in about 2020, the rest of the pro-nuclear community was like pretty excited about that. Like, she was very glamorous and sort of had this celebrity aspect that no one else really had. So yeah, she also did some, I mean, she's very wealthy. She's married, or not married, but I think her partner is a founder of Airbnb. And so, yeah, I mean, she had lots of connections and was able to, I think, be pretty influential. She was focusing in particular on Diablo Canyon, and managed to be pretty influential in that fight.
Even with with Grimes, right? And then even Elon Musk, who in those days was still a good guy.
Right.
Believe it or not.
It's so funny how quickly, like, my book isn't even out yet, and I feel like parts of it feel dated because so much has changed so quickly. And part of it is, yes, I mentioned at one point that she was friends with Elon Musk, which is going to read really differently now than it did when I wrote it.
Well, I mean, he's been on a journey as well, I guess.
Yeah.
There's going to be books written about what Elon Musk has done too. I'm sure you could advance some theories.
Yeah. And he also became pro-nuclear over time.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Yeah. I don't think we want him on our side in a very active way right now. But perhaps a part of the story that's left out is the international dimension. I mean, WePlanet, who's hosting this podcast, we have, well, we were sort of founded by pro-nuclear groups in everywhere from France to Poland to Finland, Sweden. There were often eco-modernist groups, but being pro-nuclear was part of their founding DNA, if you like. And that's just Europe. I mean, there's been a lot going on elsewhere, from Taiwan, Japan. So tell us what your understanding is of kind of the international dimension of pro-nuclear activism.
Yeah, as you said, I didn't really focus on that. I did know about WePlanet and was very intrigued by your group, and I thought I would be able to fit it in. One thing I learned writing a book, like when I started, I thought, oh, I'll just be able to fit everything in because it's a book, but it turns out that that's not the case. So unfortunately, I had to leave that out. But yeah, I think I know that Mothers for Nuclear, they have very small, I think, chapters in different countries and connections throughout the world.
Well, there's the Stand Up for Nuclear. I think that's perhaps more in Europe as well.
Yeah. And I think Stand Up for Nuclear was, I think it was originally part of Michael Schellenberger's group, Environmental Progress. And
might well have been. I have to ask our podcast producer, Rob, who's muted, so unable to contribute, but he was involved in Belgium as well.
Okay.
So yeah, a lot of us have sort of fairly deep roots in this movement.
So a young woman named Paris Ortiz-Wines, who was an employee at Environmental Progress, she left and continued that project. And I think she still runs that project as far as I know. Right.
But to the extent that there's been a nuclear renaissance, it's not been in the US. I mean, you might have saved, well, I don't mean you personally, but the movement might have helped save some nuclear stations from being shut down prematurely. But where there's been new builds, and there's been one or two in Europe, which have been very over budget and have taken a long time. But China's probably where the center of action is, the Middle East. I mean, other places which, to what extent does kind of political pro-nuclear activism come into that equation?
That's a good question. I don't really know. I would be surprised if that's a major factor in China, for example. It has a lot more to do with just the nature of the government. The government in China, if it wants to build nuclear plants, it'll just build nuclear plants. It's a lot harder in the US because for a lot of reasons, and including, our whole regulatory structure. So yeah, you're right. I mean, but there's been a lot going on in the US in recent years. It just hasn't quite yet resulted in any new plants actually running. But I mean, there's been a ton happening that I think people hope will lead to that. But I mean, there are, dozens of startups. There has been this whole series of bipartisan legislation of laws that passed starting during Obama's administration, or at least Obama took a really important executive action. And then I think the laws mainly passed after his tenure. But yeah, just a really strong bipartisan consensus at the level of elected officials.
I want to dig into that a bit more because it's almost like nuclear's, saving grace is that everyone should be able to agree on it. I mean, it's the only climate technology that Republicans still support.
Right.
They say Musk, Trump, everyone's pro-nuclear, the Democrats too. Is this beginning to translate to serious action now?
I think you could argue that. So it's not really, it's just been taking a long time to actually get plants up and running. And I think you could argue about whether that's inherent to nuclear power or whether it's because of regulatory hurdles. I think it's probably a bit of both, but certainly in terms of, the money going into it and the political support. And I visited Idaho National Lab, where there's just a lot of research going on. But not only that, they're directly working with a lot of these startups now. So yeah, I think people hope that in the next few years, or at least, where are we, at least by 2030, that we'll start to see. And of course, the hope is that once you get first of a kind plants built, then after that, it will become a lot quicker. But I think it still remains to be seen.
Well, it hasn't been sucked into the culture wars, unlike renewables and even EVs to some extent. And I think it's just, people on the right have always been in favor of big projects, hard science, don't worry too much about mining and, environmental impacts and so on. And that's the side of the argument that nuclear has always been on. And now suddenly you get people, well, like me and, you and many people listening and people involved in WePlanet who have, I suppose, historically emerged more from the liberal left, who are also like, yeah, we need nuclear because we care about climate change. And so there's this weird kind of convergence. And is that your reading of the politics of this too, or is it a bit different?
Yeah, absolutely. And one other dimension is in the US, we hear a lot lately about how Republicans have lost trust completely in institutions and expertise, and liberals, Democrats have gained it. Dating back to the 60s and 70s, it was the left that had no trust, no faith in institutions. But now, especially, I think COVID is the best example of this. It was the opposite. It was liberals who were deferring to the experts and in institutions like the WHO, and it was Republicans who hated them and didn't trust them at all. So I think that's a really important factor in why liberals have become more open to nuclear. And yeah, I've thought about how in the US, the dynamic is so often, if liberals like it, then conservatives hate it. And that has not happened yet. I don't see any signs that it's going to happen. Maybe if progressives start to get really unanimously, vocally pro-nuclear, maybe something like that would happen.
It's really interesting with RFK Jr. That the health, healthy eating, organic farming, pesticides, GMOs even, these have now become right-wing opposition, and they very much started on the left. So it might cross over, I don't know.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Everything is just very scrambled right now. And I think the left is, of course, losing trust in institutions now, mostly because of who has taken over institutions. And there's good reason to lose trust in those institutions. So yeah, it's hard to say where.
Yeah, I wouldn't trust RFK Jr. to run a nation's vaccine policy.
Right.
I mean, the guy's a fully paid up anti-vaxxer. So, but that was sort of the point. Trump's trolling the entire machinery of government, and and yeah, as you say, it just scrambles everything. You bookend the book with the story, the narrative, with Diablo Canyon. So, this sort of iconic nuclear power station on the west coast of California, which is about to be shut down, and that's where you start. Then the pro-nuclear gets involved. Sorry, the pro-nuclear movement then gets involved, and the political dynamics change somewhat. And also, interestingly, you involve the Native American perspective on this too. They want the land back, and there's a tribe that you talk to who. So, what? Just before we finish, what was their take on the nuclear issue?
Yeah, it was interesting because I don't know if you know, but at least in the U.S., Native Americans, well, they've had a lot of bad experiences with nuclear and
with uranium mining on Navajo lands, things like that,
mainly,
right?
Yeah, which was carried out in a very irresponsible way, and they were exposed kind of unnecessarily to a lot of toxins and suffered cancer as a result. So this tribe, the YTT Northern Chumash tribe in Central California, they had an interesting relationship with Diablo Canyon because it was on their ancestral land. So at first, well, I mainly talked to this one guy, Scott Lathrop, who's a tribe member and leader. And when he was born and raised in San Luis Obispo, which is right near where the plant is located, and when it was being built and there was a lot of controversy around it, he didn't really have a strong opinion, kind of knew it was on his tribe's ancestral land, but didn't know that much about it. But a couple of his relatives actually worked there and helped to build the plant. So it was, providing jobs. It was a source of economic development in the region. So he welcomes that. And then basically because of a couple of state laws and efforts to make amends to Indigenous people, the opportunity sort of arose to maybe try to get the land back when the plant closed. Long story short, they last I've heard, I think they're not really, the plans to get the land back have stalled, and it's not at all imminent. And with politics these days, who knows if and when any progress will actually be made. But yeah, Scott actually came to be pretty strongly pro-nuclear, and he sees the plant as, a really important resource, and it's there. So he says, would I have wanted it to be built in the first place? Maybe not, but it's there. And I think we should, maximize the use of this resource. And even when it's retired, build advanced nuclear on the site. But they also want the rest of the land. There's Diablo Canyon is located on the coast in this gorgeous area, and I'm trying to remember the exact size of it, but it's I think 17 miles of coastland. So, and it's been untouched essentially because PG&E bought all of it.
So that's the utility company, right?
Yeah, the utility bought all this land and they developed a small part of it where they built the nuclear plant, but the rest of the land is still pretty pristine. And so the tribe wants to get the land back and conserve it. And they're working with a couple of partners, and that's kind of their vision, is to get the land back. But Scott, at least speaking personally, they'd like to, lease the land to PG&E or, to recoup some of this value. But what was interesting was that they have kind of a nuanced view and they're not anti-nuclear.
So finish the story of Diablo Canyon. What happened in the end?
So in the end, well, in 2022, after, I guess I didn't really tell the whole story about what happened in they were going to shut it down in 2016. They'd reached this deal with labor environmental groups. They were going to transition to a California that was all wind and solar and water. Then the pro-nuclear groups stepped in to protest. That was not necessarily the main reason, but they eventually did reverse that decision. The conventional wisdom is that it was largely because of reliability issues, because there had been rolling blackouts. And so in the summer of 2022, Governor Newsom really pressured the legislature to reverse that decision, to open the door to keeping the plant open for at least 5 years longer. So I have to admit, I don't know if there have been any very recent developments. I guess I should definitely look into this, but I think the current plan is, when they passed that legislation in 2022, the plan was to extend the life from 2025 to 2030. So it was, just a 5-year extension. Doesn't really sound like that big a deal, maybe, but I think it was a symbol, and activists on both sides saw it as a symbol. It was Diablo Canyon, this controversial plant that people had been fighting over for half a century. And the pro-nuclear people saw it as, if we can keep Diablo Canyon open, then it could sort of herald a new nuclear age in California and throughout the country and the world. And the anti-nuclear people also had always seen it as a symbol. And so to them, it was kind of a tragedy that they thought it was going to close, and then it wasn't going to close.
So victory to the pro-nuclear movement. Yay. The book is called Atomic Dreams. Here it is again. And when is it out already, or is it coming out soon?
It comes out April 8th, which is next week.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks to your publisher for sending me a preview copy in
Yeah,
that case.
I don't even have one yet, actually. I haven't.
Oh, yeah. I'll send you this if you like. I am pretty sure there's some nuke bros out there who'll want to get their sweaty hands on this. So we'll send a text to the WhatsApp group, which I'm on, and make sure everyone knows about it. But I'm sure listeners to the podcast will also really want to have a look. Thanks again for Rebecca for coming on the show and for sharing everything you've learned about this very strange creature of the pro-nuclear movement with us. It's been fascinating to hear about something that one's been a bit involved in from the perspective of an outsider and a really a stellar journalist like you. So thanks for all the work that you've done and for coming and sharing your experience with us.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks so much for listening to Saving the World from Bad Ideas, a WePlanet podcast. WePlanet's a movement of citizens and scientists dedicated to defending the science and solutions we need to save the world. Please do subscribe and share a nice review. It helps us spread the message. We'd also love to hear your feedback and suggestions at our email, podcast@weplanet.org. Please also join our podcast mailing list and we'll let you know when a new episode drops. Just go to savingtheworldfrombadideas.org or weplanet.org/podcast right now. See you next time.